Today I want to talk a little bit about how we can deal with the situation we're confronting now with this coronavirus using one of the most famous similes that the Buddha ever gave, which is the simile of the two arrows. So what I want to do is to dive into that simile and talk a little bit about the sort of depth of it. In other words, he doesn't just give this simile, but he then describes various ways in which we can use it and the lessons that it presents us to live our lives better, particularly in situations like the one we're confronting right now. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel. And if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos, click the bell down below. In the simile of the two arrows, the Buddha basically describes the difference between the way most of us respond to bad things in our lives, pains, discomforts, unpleasantness, and the way that an awakened person would do so. So the idea here is that there are two potential arrows that we can get shot with. The first one, the first arrow, is the arrow of normal physical pain, physical discomfort, the problems in life that many of us, that all of us in fact have to deal with, such as not only the physical pains, let's say, of illness, if we happen to get sick, old age, the pains that surround death. I mean, these are the sorts of things that all of us have to deal with at some point. But also, we might say, the ordinary discomforts of having to deal with confinement, the ordinary discomforts and things that sort of turn us off about life that we can't get away from. All things change, for example. That's a sort of a feature of life that we all have to deal with. And this first arrow, this arrow of, we might say, physical pains and discomforts, is the sort of thing that all of us have to deal with, including, let's say, the Buddha himself. The second arrow, however, is special in a certain way. It's the arrow that we might call suffering or unsatisfactoriness. It's the mental pain, anguish, suffering that accompanies all of what we've just described. It accompanies all of the pains, discomforts of that first arrow. So, for example, the Buddha says, when an uneducated, ordinary person experiences painful physical feelings, they sorrow and pine and lament, beating their breast and falling into confusion. In other words, when we have to undergo difficult times, when we have to undergo physical pain or just the annoyance, let's say, of confinement, or let's say waiting on a long line somewhere, our minds tend to play tricks on us. They get into cycles of obsessive thinking, of complaints, of a feeling of inner annoyance, of feeling perhaps mental chatter of anger and so on. And that's a different kind of suffering, a different kind of pain. In other words, we all have the first pain of the actual physical discomfort, let's say. We all have the annoyance of having to stay at home when we would prefer to be out doing something else. But this second arrow is adding suffering on top of pain. And that's really the issue with it. Indeed, in this sutta where he discusses these two arrows, the Buddha then goes on to discuss the problem in more depth, I think. Because the real deep issue here is that we all have certain underlying tendencies. We have these underlying tendencies to greed, to ill will or anger, and to confusion or ignorance. And what happens in these situations, therefore, is that when we are confronted with physical suffering or physical pain or simply the unpleasantnesses of life, our underlying tendency towards aversion or ill will, there's different names for the same or very similar kinds of underlying tendencies. Ill will, aversion, tends to arise within us, and this underlying tendency is what's responsible for our mental chatter, for this kind of obsessive mental thinking. As the Buddha says, when they're touched by painful feeling, they resist it. The underlying tendency for repulsion towards painful feeling underlies that. That is, our underlying tendency towards repulsion, or as I said before, aversion. This underlying tendency within us ordinary folk who aren't awakened yet, its effect, its conditioning, is to cause in us these kinds of mental operations, these obsessive mental operations, when whatever the pain is doesn't go away. So we may be stuck with an illness over many days or weeks. We may be stuck with, let's say, confinement of some kind in our house for many weeks, as we've seen now with the coronavirus. And when these sorts of pain, these kinds of inconveniences don't evaporate quickly, as they often don't, what happens is that these underlying tendencies cause in us mental obsessions. And the mental obsessions then are a different kind of suffering that we have to undergo along with the suffering that we are stuck with. However, these underlying tendencies of ours, in particular the underlying tendency of greed, let's say, has also a different outlet that we can also perhaps see nowadays in our lives as we're stuck at home or perhaps stuck in bed with an illness. As the Buddha goes on to say, when touched by painful feeling, they look forward to enjoying sensual pleasures. Why is that? Because an uneducated ordinary person doesn't understand any escape from painful feeling apart from sensual pleasures. Since they look forward to enjoying sensual pleasures, the underlying tendency to greed for pleasant feeling underlies that. That is, we have a tendency for greed. That is, greed for sense pleasures, things that are pleasurable to us. And when we're stuck in a lack of sense pleasures, or as in this particular circumstance, when we're stuck with a situation that's painful to some degree, the only thing that comes to mind to get ourselves out of that is to get more sense pleasures. So this tendency to greed sort of grasps at something that isn't present for us, grasps at something in the future perhaps, or perhaps something in the past, pining after the past, some situation which isn't with us now, but which we found pleasant before, or fantasizing about some future which may or may not come true, and we can sort of get lost in thought that way. That may be, to be honest, it may be pleasant for a while to sort of get ourselves lost in thought. It's a distraction, and that's really the point of it for the mind, is to distract us. But oftentimes if we're, let's say, stuck in a particular circumstance for a period of time, these distractions can become obsessive, can become problematic, can become painful on their own, and let's face it, oftentimes they really don't lead to anything. And this whole process is a process of attachment to one degree or another. That is, our emotional attachment towards gaining sense pleasures, gaining things that are pleasurable for us, and avoiding things that are painful or unpleasant. And we can see how this works if we're sick, we're for a period of time in perhaps serious pain, or at least some pain and discomfort. Our mind may spin and spin and spin, trying to think of ways to get us out of that, or just fantasize about a future or a past. We may complain and lament, as the Buddha says, get angry at people, become unpleasant, because we ourselves are trying to push this away without success. And similarly, if we're stuck in something less painful, like a quarantine or like a confinement, but nevertheless something that's unpleasant, the same thing can happen. And this is where we're stuck right now. Most all of us, I think, is trying to deal with this kind of situation. These are all situations. They're forms of suffering, what the Buddha would term dukkha in the Pali term, which basically means a sense of unsatisfactoriness with the way things are. And this unsatisfactoriness arises through this second arrow. That's the simile here. This second arrow, which is the mental obsession that surrounds a circumstance in the world which we can't get away from. And we may wonder what to do. Now, we aren't ourselves awakened, so we're not in a position just to jump right into the deep end of the pool, let's say, but we can at least take inspiration from these similes, or this simile of the Buddha's, because the simile makes clear to us what the other option is. And the Buddha says that somebody who is awakened is going to avoid this second arrow. No, none of us avoids the first one. We all have to deal with the ordinary pains of life. But the awakened person is somebody who is not then shot with the second arrow of suffering, of mental anguish, of mental obsession about these sorts of things. That is to say, they have gotten away from attachment to pain, I should say attachment to pleasures and avoidance of pains. Now, I say that they've gotten away from attachment, we would say that they're non-attached. And I would distinguish that from being detached, because the word detached in English tends to have a connotation that they are sort of, they don't care, that they're careless. And that's not the case. In particular, let's say, the Buddha certainly didn't like loud noises. He liked silence. So he didn't want his monastics to be making lots of noise when they were in his presence. He had preferences. It wasn't that he didn't have preferences. And so we want to be, it's a very subtle distinction one here, but very, very important, I think, is that an awakened person is not somebody literally without preferences, because the Buddha certainly preferred skillful actions to unskillful actions and silence to noise. And the Buddha would almost certainly prefer a pleasant state of mind to a state of pain. However, the point is that they've given up their attachments here, which means that they're no longer beset by obsessive mental operations. They're no longer beset by complaints, inner complaints that they then feel the need to vocalize, let's say. That is, as the Buddha describes it, for the awakened person, these underlying tendencies of greed, of hatred, or ill will, or resistance have dried up. And ignorance as well, and confusion. These three have dried up. They're no longer beset by them. Now, for the rest of us, this description of the awakened state is going to be a long way away, perhaps, but perhaps this can at least give us some inspiration towards the goal that we're trying to aim towards. So even if we aren't going to get there, perhaps, anytime soon, we can at least say, here's where we're trying to go. And if we can perhaps make small baby steps along that path to where we're less attached to our pleasures in life, where we become more content with the way things are, and where we're less aversive to the pains in our life, and we're less attached to losing those pains, then we will get ourselves farther along than that second arrow. While we may be still having to deal with that second arrow, it won't be quite, let's say, as painful as it would have been. So if we want to inhabit the mind of an awakened person to some degree, we want to get ourselves into a position, a sort of a mental frame, where we see the ordinary pains of life, the ordinary discomforts and problems, as simply a part of the way things are, and that they should be accepted, and that we should learn slowly, as best we can, to be content with the way things are, however they may be, and however they may confront us. And I think it may also be of some comfort to know that Buddhas may also have to deal with their own pains. I did an earlier video on that very topic of whether the Buddha has to feel pain, whether the Buddha did feel pain. And because I think it's interesting to look at the Buddha's own life as an example of somebody who did feel pain, even after he was awakened and admitted to it, he talked about it, and found a way to deal with it. So if you want to take a look at that, I would recommend it. It's up on the screen. I'll put it right here. You can click on it. I hope all of you remain well, healthy, safe, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos.